The Academy Days, Part 5.
We now have an official Android app available right on the Play Store. The link is in the pinned comment below. Go ahead and download it now. The whole Black Ship catalog is available, including all side stories and the full books. You can download all free content straight to your phone for offline playback, but downloading is a perk, so just subscribe to one author or the platform to unlock this feature. Download the app now while you listen. Now, back to the story.
The parade ground hadn't changed. 3 years, and the transparasteel panels still showed the same stars, the same elegant void, the same beautiful, captivating infinite black that was meant to inspire awe and purpose in the hearts of young men and women who had earned the right to serve among it. The flogging post had been removed for the occasion, replaced by a raised stage draped in the deep purple and gold of the Principality's colors, but Wyatt knew exactly where it had stood. Center deck, 6 paces from the front row, bolted to the plating. He could see the faint discoloration where the bolt holes had been filled and polished over, not quite matching the surrounding deck. They'd cleaned it up nicely. You'd never notice unless you'd once had your wrists clamped to it while 112 people watched. 3 years. He was 17 now, taller by several inches, leaner in the way that academy rations and relentless physical training produced. His jaw more defined, his eyes carrying the empty stillness of someone who had learned to watch everything and react to nothing. The second-hand uniform had been replaced 3 times, as he'd outgrown each one, and the current iteration was pressed to a standard that would have satisfied the most exacting inspection officer in the station. Crestless, of course. Still crestless, but immaculate. He'd arrived early before the formation was called. Old habit. The parade ground was empty at this hour, and he'd stood at the transparasteel panels for a few minutes, looking out at the void and taking quiet inventory of the year behind him. The 3rd year had been more of the same and less of it in equal measure. More training runs after the Hessek corridor, each one led by a noble, each one requiring Wyatt to fly the sharp end while someone else held the rank. His simulation training hours, as it became a common thing since the start of his 2nd year, were cut off or rarely received. But when he received them for score testing, the scores climbed higher than they had any right to, and were adjusted downward before they reached the official record. Beaumont Hale had tried, Wyatt was certain of it, to push his rankings lower. But there were limits to how far even a vindictive instructor could bend the numbers. Raw scores were logged automatically by the simulation systems before anyone could touch them, and while the final rankings could be massaged, the underlying data was harder to bury entirely. But lessons could be manipulated, denied him training, and relegating him to learn through other means. The result was that Wyatt graduated in a rank below every noble in the flight program. Last among them, for that was a given, but first among the commoners despite everything else. The highest-ranked commoner pilot in the year group, which was a distinction that meant everything to the people who understood what it had cost, and nothing at all to the blue bloods who decided where a mere plebeian was to sit on the list. Not that any of them would say it aloud. The nobles couldn't acknowledge that a commoner belonged anywhere near the top of the rankings without admitting that the rankings were built on something other than merit. Most commoners knew, but saying so would paint targets on their backs. And any commoner smart enough to know that wasn't stupid enough to speak out loud. And so, Wyatt's position occupied the same quiet, uncomfortable space that everything about him occupied at this academy, visible to everyone, spoken of by no one. The year group stood in formation for the last time. 104 novices, 8 fewer than had started 3 years ago. 4 had washed out, 2 had been expelled for conduct violations that almost certainly had more to do with who they'd offended than what they'd done. 1 had transferred to the engineering track after a simulation accident that needed to replace her left hand with a cybernetic prosthetic, and 1, a commoner from an outer colony, had simply disappeared one morning. His bunk was empty, his locker cleaned out, his name removed from the roster. Nobody explained. Nobody asked. Commoners learned early that some questions didn't have answers, and those that did were worse. The formation was arranged as it always had been. Nobles in the front rows, commoners in the rear. Wyatt stood in the back left, the same position he'd occupied for every parade, every assembly, every public occasion where the Academy's hierarchy needed to express itself in spatial terms. Petra Dainton was 4 places to his right. They hadn't spoken after the training run months ago, but the ambiance between them had settled into something that required no maintenance. They existed in the same space, understood the same things, and neither needed the other to confirm it. The stage was occupied by the Academy's senior staff, arranged by rank. At the center, the Academy director, a semi-retired rear admiral, whose name Wyatt had heard perhaps 3 times in as many years. Flanking him were his personal staff and senior instructors. And there, third from the left on the second row, wearing his formal instructor's uniform with the commendations for administrative diligence polished to their usual shine, was Flight Instructor Aldrich Beaumont Hale. Wyatt looked at him the way he looked at everything in this academy, with the flat, calibrated attention of a pilot reading a sensor display. 3 years of data, all cataloged, all filed, all stored in the ledger that lived behind his eyes. The man who had punished him for flying too well, for being better than him. The man who had sentenced him to 15 lashes, then watched 5 of them get taken away by an officer with real combat ribbons. The man who had sent him into the Drazen simulation and pulled an alarm when the commoner was about to win. The man who, Wyatt was quietly and permanently certain, had tried to sabotage him at every possible turn, without drawing eyes unto himself, after humiliating him, and who had written something in his file that would follow him for the rest of his career. Beaumont Hale sat with his hands folded in his lap, his expression arranged into the dignified satisfaction of an instructor watching his students graduate. From this distance, with the stage lights catching his dull, silver cybernetic eyes, he looked almost distinguished. Almost proud. The kind of man you might trust to have shaped young pilots into something worthy of the Principality's service. What a magnificent fraud you are, sir. 3 years of watching you, and I still can't decide whether you know you're terrible or genuinely believe you're not. Either way, you'll sit up there and smile while names are called that you tried to bury, and nobody will say a word because the system doesn't reward honesty or the honor you blue bloods love so much. It rewards this. Whatever this is, Wyatt thought, allowing himself the luxury of contempt in the only place it was safe, in his mind. Just as Mr. Warlow had taught him. The ceremony began. The director spoke first. Duty, honor, service, the sacred traditions of the Royal Navy. It was the same speech every director had given at every graduation since this academy's founding, delivered with the practiced cadence of a man who had given it many times and would give it many more. It washed over the formation like recycled air, familiar, necessary, and entirely without flavor. Then came the commendations. Noble names filled the parade ground. House crests were announced alongside grades and distinctions. Each recipient walked to the stage, saluted the director, received their commendation, saluted again, and returned to their place to polite, measured applause. Novice Aldwin Mercer, House Mercer of Ostwind. Distinguished performance in tactical leadership. Flight score commendation. Exemplary conduct. Aldwin walked to the stage, his pace carrying the dignified strength of a noble who knew where he belonged and what his worth was. The silver and green crest of House Mercer caught the stage lights, and his gray, cybernetic eyes, the upgraded mid-high grade set his father had gifted him, swept the formation with the practiced confidence of someone accepting what he was owed. Beaumont Hale presented the commendation. They saluted dry and to the point. The applause was polite and genuine, the kind reserved for a noble son who had performed well enough to honor his house without doing anything so remarkable as to make anyone uncomfortable. Mercer returned to his place in the front row. As he passed the center aisle, his eyes found Wyatt's. Half a second. No more. No nod, no acknowledgement, no repetition of the 3 words he'd said in a corridor after the training run. Just a look, brief and unreadable, that passed between 2 people who both knew something that the commendation on the stage hadn't mentioned and never would. Wyatt held the look for exactly the time it took to register it, then returned his gaze to the stage. The formation continued. More names, more crests, more applause. A commendation for academic excellence went to a noble whose examination scores Wyatt knew for a fact were lower than his own, because he had seen the preliminary rankings before they were adjusted. A flight distinction commendation went to a noble whose best simulation time was nearly double Wyatt's worst. A leadership commendation went to a boy who had, during the training run, screamed into his comms while his seagull spun toward an asteroid. Truly inspiring leadership, Lord Hargrove. I'm sure your future squadron will feel very safe under your command, Wyatt thought, the sarcasm so thick he was surprised it didn't show on his face. The system worked as it was designed to. Wyatt watched it work, and felt the ledger add its entries with the quiet, mechanical efficiency of a machine that had been running for hundreds of years and saw no reason to stop. Then came the commoners. There were no commendations for commoners. There had never been. What there was, instead, was a brief, functional segment at the end of the ceremony where commoner certifications were distributed. No names read aloud, no achievements summarized, no applause. A proctor stepped to the front of the stage with a stack of data cards and read a list of names in an empty, emotional, flat tone that would make someone processing inventory sound excited in comparison. Novice Petra Dainton. Certification confirmed. Novice Wyatt Staples. Certification confirmed. Novice. The names blurred together. 67 commoners, 67 certifications, 67 data cards distributed by a proctor who didn't look up from his list. The front rows, the noble rows, maintained the polite attention of people who understood that this segment was necessary, and also understood, with equal clarity, that it was not for them. Wyatt received his data card when the proctor reached his row. A small rectangle of encoded plastic that confirmed, in the dry language of naval bureaucracy, that he had completed 3 years of training at the Royal Navy Academy and was certified for active service in the fighter division. It did not mention his simulation scores, or the flogging, or any of the 100 injustices that had marked his passage through this place. It was a data card. It said he was qualified. That was all it said, and that was all it would ever say. It was all he needed from it. He held it in his hand, looked at it for precisely 1 second, and slipped it into his pocket. His chest tightened for a half-second, something between anger and amusement fighting for space behind his ribs. Amusement won? It usually did these days. 3 years of his life compressed into a rectangle that weighed less than a coil gun round and meant approximately as much to the people who had issued it. The director returned to the podium for closing remarks. More words about duty and honor. Wyatt stood in formation and let them pass through him like starlight through transparent steel. His mind was elsewhere. Not on the ceremony, not on the commendations he hadn't received, not on the blue bloods in the front rows admiring each other's crests. His mind was on what came next. The postings. The fleet. The cockpit. Serve in the Royal Navy. Survive until retirement with a pension. Go home to Volantis. 3 goals. Simple, clean, unambitious by any standard that a noble and a majority of his fellow commoners would recognize. No aspirations to glory. No fantasies of rising above his station. No dreams about commanding a mighty vessel. Just service. Just survival. Just a pension and a ticket home to a family that was waiting for him on a colony world 4 jumps away, where his mother would hold him too tightly, and his father would tell him to remember his place, and Westcall would be taller than he remembered, and Wham, 11 now, would demand the stories about stars that Wyatt had promised him 3 years ago in a narrow hallway while trying not to cry. And Warlow, the old man with the cane and the vocabulary that would earn him a flogging, the man who had warned him that the principality would reshape him and had been right, though not in the way either of them had expected. The ceremony ended. The formation was dismissed. 104 novices broke ranks for the last time, and the parade ground filled with the noise of people who were, for the first time in 3 years, no longer novices. Wyatt stood where he was for a moment longer. The transparasteel panels showed the stars, the same void he had dreamed about on a scratched metal ceiling in the commoner dormitory. He was going out there, finally. Whatever came next, wherever they sent him, whatever the blue bloods had written in his file, or buried in their systems, or whispered in their corridors, he was going out there. The year group dispersed the way it had done everything for 3 years, nobles first, commoners after. He turned from the parade ground and walked toward the dormitory wing. His expression betrayed nothing. The mask was perfect. It had been perfect for 3 years. Underneath it, for just a moment, the boy from Volantis smiled. The noble quarters filled with noise within minutes of the ceremony's end. Laughter, congratulations. The particular volume of people who had been given official permission to celebrate themselves and were taking full advantage. Doors opened and closed. Families who had attended the ceremony via holographic relay sent messages that chimed through personal terminals in a cascade of pride and expectation. Postings were compared, futures were planned, and the comfortable machinery of privilege hummed along as smoothly as it always had. The commoner dormitory was quiet. 67 graduates packed their belongings with the efficient silence they were used to and had come to master. The bunks were stripped. The lockers were emptied. 3 years of life in a room with no partitions and no privacy, reduced to single bags and data cards and the particular emptiness of a space that had never really been yours to begin with, ready to receive new occupants in a new group. Next year, another group would graduate. As the year prior, another group had graduated, on and on like machinery. Wyatt packed quickly. There wasn't much to pack. A few changes of clothes, his toiletries, the data card in his pocket, and a small wooden carving he'd made during his first year, shaped from a scrap of packing material with a blade borrowed from the maintenance stores. It was rough, unfinished, The kind of thing Warlow would have critiqued with a grunt and then kept on his shelf anyway. He could almost hear the old man's voice. "The grain's all wrong, rascal. Did you carve this with your eyes closed or just your brain?" Wyatt hadn't shown it to anyone. He slipped it into his bag alongside everything else and closed the fastening. Staples. He turned. Petra Dainton stood at the end of his bunk row, her own bag over one shoulder, her uniform pressed to regulation standard. She didn't approach. She didn't need to. The regulation width between bunks was more than enough distance for what needed to be said. "Dainton," he replied. She looked at him for a moment. Not searching, not assessing, just looking, the way you look at someone you've shared a particular kind of experience with and don't need to explain it to. She'd survived by disappearing. He'd survived by being impossible to ignore. Different methods, same result. They were both still here. "We made it," she said. It wasn't a celebration. It was an observation, stated with the same flat precision she brought to everything. "We did." A pause. The dormitory hummed around them. Other commoners moved past, bags in hand, eyes forward, already on their way to whatever came next. "Where did they post you?" Wyatt asked. "Fourth Fleet. Patrol Squadron. Outer Territories." She said it without inflection, the way commoners said everything about their postings because enthusiasm invited scrutiny and disappointment implied ingratitude. "You? Don't know yet. Notifications pending." She nodded. Another pause. Then, with the ghost of something that might have been warmth if it had been given more room to breathe, "See you out there, Staples." "Fly safe, Dainton." She turned and walked out of the dormitory. Her footsteps were even and unhurried, the same measured pace she'd maintained for 3 years, the pace of someone who had perfected the art of leaving a room without anyone noticing she'd been in it. The door closed behind her, and Wyatt stood alone in the bunk row, holding his bag, looking at the empty space where she'd been. That was it. It was more than most commoners exchanged at graduation. He slung his bag over his shoulder and walked out. The corridors were busier than usual, filled with the disorganized movement of 104 people whose schedules had, for the first time in 3 years, been replaced by the formless gap between graduation and departure. Wyatt moved through them without hurry, and without fully deciding to, he found himself taking the long route, not toward the departure terminal. Through the academy. He passed the simulation chambers where he'd killed an instructor's fighter in 1 minute and 31 seconds, and taken 3 Drazen kills before an alarm stole the 4th. He passed the hangar where he'd sat in a real cockpit for the first time and felt the engine answer to his hands. He passed the mess hall where he'd eaten 1,000 silent breakfasts at the commoner table while the blue bloods laughed too loudly 3 sections away. He'd almost missed the food. Almost. In the way that a man who'd survived a plague might almost miss the fever. It was terrible, but at least it was predictable. He turned to the maintenance access section near the lower utility shafts. The same section he'd retreated to in his first year, after Beaumont Hale's office, after the corridor with Mercer, after the punishment that had started all of it. The cold bulkhead was exactly where he'd left it. The air still tasted faintly of metal. The hum of the utility system still provided the same low, constant backdrop that had accompanied every private exhale he'd allowed himself in this place. He leaned against the bulkhead. One last time. He didn't close his eyes. He looked at the opposite wall, the same scratched, unremarkable surface he'd stared at 100 times before, and let the academy settle into its final shape in his mind. Not nostalgia. Inventory. The last entries were filed before the ledger closed on this particular chapter. 3 years ago, Warlow had warned him. Good lads go in and something else comes out. The Principality doesn't just use commoners, Wyatt. It reshapes them, files down everything that makes them dangerous until all that's left is obedience. The old man had been right about the reshaping. He'd been wrong about the final shape. The Academy hadn't made Wyatt obedient, at least not in the way it had done to many others. It had tried, with floggings and servitude and voided scores and the slow, grinding weight of a system that punished skill and rewarded compliance. And it had failed, because the boy who had walked through the gates at 14 with no name and no crest and no illusions had refused, at every turn, to surrender the one thing the system couldn't take from him by force: the knowledge that he could fly. Of course, he would obey the orders Blue Bloods gave him. That was part of the reason they left him alone. He never objected, never showed disrespect, and had no dignity to protect. And for most petulant nobles, that simply wasn't entertaining. He knew his place, and he had no desire to step outside of it willingly. But those were lessons he carried with him, not what the Academy tried to imprint into him. But the Academy had done something else. It had taught him that he was right. That isolation worked, to remain masked. Armored in silence and precision, and the cold arithmetic of a ledger that recorded every cost without ever collecting on the debt. It had made him a boy who shut doors on the only person who had tried to open one, who walked through crowded corridors without a single person he could call a friend, who had just said goodbye to the closest thing he had to one in 4 lines, and a nod. Warlow had been afraid of what handling it would turn him into. Standing in the maintenance shaft, bag over his shoulder, leaning against the same bulkhead he'd leaned against 100 times before, Wyatt wondered if the old man would recognize what had come out. He pushed himself off the wall, straightened his uniform, adjusted the bag on his shoulder. The academy was behind him.
You can watch the next chapter of Academy Days right now on Vox 9. The same goes for all the Black Ship main and side stories. Just click the link in the pinned comment under this video. It goes straight to part 5 of Academy Days, so you can continue to listen. See you over there. Now back to the story.
He walked toward the departure terminal. The departure terminal was the same functional, charmless space it had been 3 years ago. Different angle, same architecture, gray walls, utilitarian seating, a boarding gate staffed by personnel who processed bodies the way the mess hall processed rations, efficiently and without curiosity. The commoner section was predictably the least maintained part of the facility. Some things were consistent across the entire principality, and the quality of spaces allocated to commoners was one of them. Wyatt sat on a metal bench near the gate, his bag at his feet, his data card safely nestled in his pocket, and his posting notification glowing on his personal terminal. He hadn't opened it yet. It had arrived during his walk through the academy, a quiet chime he'd felt through the device in his pocket. Whatever it said would still be there after he did what he needed to do first. He pulled out his datapad, the same worn device he'd carried from Volantis 3 years ago, and composed a message. To Staples Family, 47V Residential District Outskirts, Volantis. He stared at the blank space below the address line for several seconds. 3 years of silence, broken by the occasional short message that said nothing of substance, because substance was dangerous in a place where communications could be monitored, and a commoner's words could be turned into evidence of dissatisfaction. He'd sent them updates. I'm well. Training continues. The food is adequate. The kind of messages that confirmed he was alive without confirming anything else. This one needed to be different. Not much. Just enough. Mom, Dad, Weskel, Wam. I graduated today. Certified for Active Service Fighter Division. Posting assignment just came through. Heading to my first squadron. The academy was what Mr. Warlow warned me it would be. I learned what they taught me and a few things they didn't intend to. I'm fine! I'm ready. He paused. His fingers hovered over the keypad. The next part came harder than the rest. Not because the words were difficult, but because the feeling underneath them was. And Wyatt had spent 3 years learning to keep feelings at a distance where they couldn't be used against him. Wham, I promised you stories about the stars. I have some now. They're not the ones either of us imagined, but they're mine, and I'll tell you every one of them when I get home. Look after Weskel for me, or let him look after you. Whichever one of you is taller now. Mom, when this is done, I'm coming back. That's a promise. Dad, I remembered my place. You'd be proud of how well I remembered it, I think. He read it back. It was too long by his usual standards, and too short by any honest measure of what 3 years away from his family deserved. But it was true, all of it in the way that mattered, and he sent it before he could edit the warmth out of it. The second message was shorter. To Warlow Pincer, 48V Residential District Outskirts, Volantis. Mr. Warlow, I graduated. Still alive, still flying, still in possession of every quality the Blue Bloods tried to file down. You were right about most of it. I'll tell you what you were wrong about over dinner when I'm home. Take care of your cane. I'll need you standing when I get back. He sent it and put the datapad away. Now the posting. Wyatt opened his personal terminal and read the notification. Pilot Wyatt Staples. Assigned 9th Patrol Squadron, 2nd Frontier Corps. Operating Corridor, Tessic Varn Frontier. Reporting Station, Outpost Kalen. Report within 7 days. The Tessic Varn Frontier. Wonderful. Not the worst name he'd ever heard for a place to die. But it was certainly in the running. He knew the name. Every novice did. Every novice knew the names of the postings that nobody wanted, and everyone pretended were honorable assignments. The Tessic Varn Corridor was a long, poorly policed stretch of frontier space that ran along the Principality's outer boundary, where pirate raids were frequent, minor incursions were routine, and the patrols that flew it were perpetually understaffed because pilots transferred out as soon as they could, were injured often enough to keep the medical bays busy, or occasionally didn't come back at all. It was the kind of posting that nobles avoided by leveraging connections and commoners received because someone had to fly the route, and the system didn't waste valuable bloodlines on expendable corridors. The 9th Patrol Squadron, specifically, had a reputation that the recruitment materials didn't mention: high churn, low prestige, and the sort of operational tempo that meant a pilot who survived and performed well could move up through the ranks faster than the system would normally permit, simply because the alternative was flying with empty slots. If the pilot survived, of course. Not prestigious, not safe, but real. Real patrols, real threats, real flying against real enemies who didn't announce their vectors or follow the approved doctrine. The opposite of everything the Academy had trained them for, and, Wyatt suspected, exactly the kind of environment where the things the Academy hadn't trained them for would matter most. He filed the posting the way he filed everything, without expression, without complaint, without giving the system the satisfaction of seeing him react. It wasn't the degrading assignment he'd expected from Beaumont Hale. How he'd managed it, though, was a mystery to him. Not that it mattered now. His posting was dangerous, underfunded, and unglamorous, but it was a cockpit on a frontier where pilots were needed, and performance couldn't be buried as easily as it could behind an Academy desk. Maybe the file note hadn't reached the posting system yet. Maybe the machinery was slower than the man who'd written it. Or maybe the Tessic Varn frontier was exactly where you sent a commoner you wanted to forget about, because the frontier had a way of solving problems that paperwork couldn't. Either way, he'd be flying. Real flying against real threats in a real cockpit that didn't smell of disinfectant and crushed ambition. He'd take those odds. He was a pilot now. He had a duty to the Principality, and he planned to fulfill it. The transport arrived. A mid-range shuttle, functional and unremarkable. The same class of vessel that had carried him from Volantis 3 years ago. He gathered his bag, joined the queue of commoner passengers filing through the boarding gate, and handed his documents to the gate attendant with the same measured efficiency he applied to everything. No family at the gate. No Warlow leaning on his cane. Just the gate attendant, who didn't look at him, and the boarding ramp, which didn't care who walked up it. Clean break. Same as before. He found a seat, stowed his bag, and strapped in. The shuttle hummed to life around him. The Academy station appeared in the viewport, gray metal and transparent steel panels, and began to shrink. Slowly at first, then faster, diminishing from a structure to a shape to a point of light to nothing at all. Gone. Wyatt settled back in his seat, closed his eyes, and let the stars carry him forward.